And T cells can reproduce at the rate of 5% a day. Simple math proves that HIV cannot infect enough T cells to cause them to die off and bring down the entire immune system. Even supporters of HIV admit that this low amount of T cell infection is a challenge to explain.
AIDS patients are characterized by the deficiency or depletion of T cells. They lack T cells, that's why they are AIDS patients. But when the first data appeared, in fact, many from Gallo's, the first real good data on that came from Gallo's lab. The surprising news was there was no virus found in T cells. Practically none. In fact, the notorious difficulties of our nation's leading, at that time, leading AIDS researcher, Robert Gallo, in finding the virus led him to his well-known problems with essentially appropriating or misappropriating, stealing the virus from Montagnier. He couldn't isolate the virus because there was no virus there, not because he is incompetent, simply he confirmed what we are just talking about, there is no virus in AIDS patients, only antibodies against it. So if 1 in 1,000 cells or even 1 in 100 cells is infected by a virus, you won't get a disease from it, you won't die from it. In order to die from a depletion of T cells, you would need to have a virus that kills more than half of them. It's like saying you're dying, you're a 25-year-old man suffering a fatal disease or dying from a fatal disease because you stuck yourself with a needle or cut yourself while shaving. You're losing about 100 or thousands of your blood with a bad cut and shaving. You're not going to die from that. But that's what Gallo's hypothesis actually said.
Reason number 4. HIV has no AIDS-causing gene. HIV has no specific gene or unique genetic reason to cause AIDS. All retroviruses have only 3 major genes, GAG, INF, and POL, and only 6 minor genes. Because the genes and genetic sequences are so limited in these very simple little viruses, they need all the genes to replicate. HIV is almost identical to all other retroviruses genetically. What most people do not know is that there are as many as 50 to 100 of these retroviruses that can be found in every healthy human body. All have the 3 genes, and all are kept under control by antibodies after infection. HIV behaves no differently than the others in the way that it mutates, becomes dormant, and reactivates. So the question is, if none of these other retroviruses cause diseases, why should HIV? Or vice versa, if HIV causes AIDS, why don't all the rest? So there's no genetic reason to explain why HIV would cause AIDS. Number 5. There is no such thing as a slow virus. HIV is said to be a slow virus that takes 10 to 12 years after infection to cause AIDS. The only way to explain this is to give HIV magical abilities to reactivate, mutate, migrate, and hibernate. These slow virus hypotheses were devised by scientists like Gaddusek and Gallo, who used them to buy time when their disease-causing agent failed to perform. They based their slow virus hypotheses on studies of Epstein-Barr, which was supposed to cause a cancer 10 years after infection, and herpes viruses that hide and reemerge in persons who have suppressed immunity and can't generate a sufficient defense. But these differ greatly from HIV, because in both cases large amounts of active virus can be found, causing specific symptoms. In total contrast, HIV is inactive, then is said to cause 30 different diseases 10 years later, none of which are specific to HIV itself. Peter Duesberg says, there's no such thing as a slow virus, only slow virologists.
A virus, including a retrovirus, causes a disease within days, weeks, or at the very most, a month after infection. And that is not a mysterious number. That number is a direct function of the generation time of the virus, the time a virus needs to infect a cell and generate new virus particles. And that takes, with all viruses we know of in humans, all of them, including HIV and including all retroviruses, at the very most 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. So whatever a virus could possibly do has to happen in that time period, or else it's not caused by that virus. And with AIDS, everybody, even from the very beginning, talked about a so-called minimal latent period or average latent period of 1 year, and now they have raised that to 10 years. In other words, we are buying lots and lots of time for something else to cause the disease that is in fact blamed on that virus. There is not, in 12 years of research, 35 billion by the American taxpayer alone, not to mention private organizations and companies in other countries. There is not even a shred of light on this question, why it would take 10 years from the infection to a disease. In fact, it's impossible.
Reason number 6. HIV is not a new virus, so HIV would not suddenly cause a new epidemic. AIDS cases have increased dramatically from 0 in 1980 to 500,000 by 1996, so researchers assumed that it could only be caused by a new virus spreading quickly into the population. An old virus would have caused an AIDS epidemic years ago, possibly even centuries ago, so HIV must be a new infection to cause the recent AIDS epidemic. But here again, the HIV/AIDS proponents bypassed yet another essential question of logic. How old is HIV and where did it come from? Theories about green monkey bites and traveling gay flight attendants run in the headlines, but no one in the government-funded research program has bothered to verify the age of HIV. Peter Duesberg says HIV is very old, using the fundamental means of dating viruses found in Farr's law.
Farr was a British epidemiologist, William Farr, in the first part of the 19th century, who noted when a new epidemic comes into a population, like AIDS is said to be new, or the virus causing it is said to be new as well, and that it spreads exponentially in that population. Translated into current tabloid newspaper reporting, it explodes into that population, like a seasonal flu epidemic. That's what Farr's law says. But if a microbe and a disease is long established, then it's old. So when you look at HIV in America, you'll find ever since it can be detected, 1 million Americans are positive. That was first reported by the Centers for Disease Control in 1995 and has since been repeated over and over and over every year for 10 years or 11 years now, almost 12 years now. So if it's in 1 million Americans for 10 years every single year, that can't be no. And those statistics are harder than anything we ever had in microbiology. 25 million Americans are tested once a year. It's 10%. A Gallup poll is usually within a percentile when you test 10,000 Americans, or 5,000 they call it by phone, and they get it within a percentage accuracy. This is done on 25 million people for 10 years. Nothing has ever been checked so carefully. That's an extremely hard number. This thing is, age is old. This virus is in America is older than America. It came in with the immigrants. That's older than the Constitution.
So, HIV is not a new virus, and many of the people who have antibodies to it got it perinatally or from their mothers, not from dirty needles or unsafe sex, and have lived full healthy lives for centuries without AIDS. Number 7. HIV fails Koch's postulates. The universal test used by scientists to determine if a disease is truly being caused by an infection was designed over 100 years ago by Robert Koch, who discovered the bacteria that causes TB. HIV fails this test. Koch's postulates state, first, the virus or bacteria must be found in all cases of the disease. Second, this germ must be isolated from the infected host and grown in a pure culture. Third, the germ must cause the same disease and injected into a new healthy host. And finally, the germ must be found growing again in the newly diseased host. HIV fails postulate number 1 because 10 to 20% of all AIDS patients have no HIV at all. When HIV can be found, it is only in very small amounts and usually dormant. HIV passes postulate number 2 only on a technicality. It can be isolated, but it takes huge amounts of cell tissue to find it. Then a difficult chemically induced process is needed to reactivate the virus. By contrast, large amounts of active virus can easily be found with other diseases. HIV fails postulate 3 hands down. HIV does not cause AIDS when injected into test animals like chimpanzees. And more importantly, human healthcare workers accidentally infected with HIV rarely get AIDS unless they use drugs and AZT. Robert Gallo and the HIV orthodoxy have dismissed Koch's postulates as old and out of date with modern medicine. But the postulates have stood the test of time, and scientists who have ignored and bypassed them have done so at their own